Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. Really looking forward to having hopefully a fruitful discussion about highways and their implications in daily life in American cities. I want to thank again all of you for coming, especially our panelists, and we can get started. Before we do, just want to lead off with some housekeeping. So as you may see, this event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online afterwards. If you have captions right now, you're welcome to hide those or adjust settings using the live transcript button. And then the biographies of our speakers, as well as our slides, will be available online or are available online right now at urban.org. Remind you that all participants are muted already, but if you have any questions, comments, please direct those to the Q&A box at any time. And we will make sure to answer those later on in our webinar. We also will have a survey at the end of this event that you will see in the chat and also be emailed to you afterwards. Should take about 1 or 2 minutes to complete. So please, if you have time, do complete that after the event. And then finally, feel free to engage with us on social media using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. So with that, we can begin our presentation. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Gabe Samuels, and I'm a research assistant with the Urban Institute. I'll be leading the beginning of today's presentation. And this webinar is accompanied by a report that was co-authored by myself and Yona Freemark, a senior research associate also at the Urban Institute. That report was published yesterday and can now be viewed on Urban's website, urban.org. So as I noted, Yona and I are both researchers at the Urban Institute, a nonprofit research organization that seeks to open minds, shape decisions, and offer solutions through economic and social policy research. So for today's agenda, I'll start by introducing the impacts of highway pollution, then move into our case study of Louisville, Kentucky. I'll then present some strategies that cities can take to address highway pollution. Afterwards, we'll be joined by our expert panelists to discuss the implications of highways and the solutions to this issue. So first, we'll identify the problem. Years of research have shown that highways, and particularly the vehicles that navigate through them, are significant emitters of pollution. Common pollutants produced by vehicles include particulate matter or soot, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and nitrogen dioxide. And most of this pollution comes from tailpipe exhaust, but vehicles can also contribute to pollution in other ways, including through tire and brake wear and through resuspended road dust. Highways also cause significant levels of noise pollution, with major contributors being heavy trucks and other vehicles that are due for maintenance. So a review of scholarly literature shows that spending significant time in close proximity to highways can have a range of serious health impacts. Highway adjacent air pollution, which most people think of when thinking about highway pollution, has been associated with lung and heart problems, as well as stroke and premature birth. There's also issues with noise pollution, which has been found to increase the incidence of type 2 diabetes, lead to higher blood pressure, and cause poor sleep and impaired cognitive performance, which themselves can have considerable impacts. Altogether, the suite of problems is leading to a serious loss of life. A recent study found that over 19,000 deaths were caused by vehicular air pollution in 2017 in the United States alone. On a positive note, this number is lower than it had been in previous years, suggesting the benefits of increased emission standards and regulations. And our research found that these health impacts are ultimately most common within 300 meters, or approximately 1,000 feet of highways. So we'll be using this buffer going forward. Now we'll take a look at the metro area of Louisville, Kentucky, to explore what life near the highway looks like at the local level in an American city. So first, I'll explain why exactly we chose to explore Louisville. Louisville's Office of Planning and Design Services is currently conducting a review of its zoning code, known as the Land Development Code, as it aims to plan a more equitable Louisville. One of the proposals that the office is considering involves potential zoning changes related to highway adjacency with a specific focus on reversing historical and equitable zoning. The city already acquires a 250-foot or roughly 75-meter setback for residential development and also has noise-sensitive community facilities around parts of highways in outer Louisville. However, this proposal could take these protections a few steps further. So what did we find with our research? Nearly 50% of Louisville residents live within 300 meters of a high-speed road with at least 4 lanes, which I'll refer to from here on out as an arterial. 13% of Louisvillians live within that distance of an interstate. And among these populations, there are some discrepancies. Nearly 50% of housing units within 50 meters of interstates and arterials, respectively, are rented. And this compares to a 38.2% rentership rate metro-wide. Public housing units are also disproportionately likely to be situated near interstates and arterials. Moreover, a higher proportion of residents below the poverty line and residents receiving SNAP or food stamp benefits live right by these roadways. Notably, we did not find considerable discrepancies in terms of race or age, but this has been found in other cities. So this graph here elucidates some of those inequities that we found. As you can see, the proportion of residents below the federal poverty level, households receiving SNAP benefits, and households with zero car access decreases the further away one gets from an arterial. Next, we looked at student population at public schools near highways. Studies have associated attending school near highways with poor academic performance, while young people, along with the elderly, are more susceptible to pollution-related health problems than their adult counterparts. So we found that more schools of all types are located within 300 meters of arterials than further away. About 1/3 of all Louisville schools are located even closer within 150 meters. And this rate is roughly the same for pre-kindergarten and elementary schools, where our youngest students attend classes. Just as we found with the overall population, children attending schools are relatively equally exposed to roadway pollution in Louisville by race. Here you can see a graph depicting the breakdown of schools by distance from arterials. As you can see, more schools of all types are located within 300 meters of arterials than further away. Finally, we examined where Louisvillians work in relation to highways. Significant majority of jobs in the metro are located within 300 meters of arterials, while slightly less than half are located within 150 meters. However, we found mixed results in terms of who is working near these highways. Employees with salaries below $1,250 per month are disproportionately likely to work near arterials and interstates, but so are employees with bachelor's degrees or higher. So what can cities like Louisville do to limit residents' exposure to highway adjacent pollution at their homes, work, and schools? We'll offer a few solutions in the next slides. So the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provide funding in the form of federal grants to cities that are hoping to address emissions and their disproportionate impacts. Under the IRA, cities can access funds from the Neighborhood Access and Equity Grant Program to improve walkability, safety, and affordable access through the construction of projects on surface transportation facilities. IIJA funding, meanwhile, includes the Reconnecting Communities Program, which provides grants for planning and capital construction for projects in neighborhoods cut off from economic and social opportunity by transportation infrastructure. States and localities can also access carbon reduction program funds to develop pollution reduction strategies, such as deploying zero emission vehicles, supporting congestion pricing, and improving biking infrastructure. Last but not least are RAISE grants, which can be used to fund sustainable infrastructure projects that promote energy efficiency and reduce pollution. In Louisville, for example, the city has already applied for a RAISE grant to reimagine their 9th Street corridor near downtown with the goal of reducing traffic and pollution exposure and improving access to park space. Cities elsewhere in the country have begun to take steps to replace problematic highways with more accessible boulevards, which can reverse infrastructure-created segregation, unlock parcels of land for redevelopment, reduce exposure to particulate pollution, and create safer routes for pedestrians and cyclists. Leaders in Syracuse, for example, are planning to demolish the elevated I-81 interstate through downtown, pictured here on the left, and replace it with the street-level community grid. In Detroit, the Michigan Department of Transportation will use funds from the Reconnecting Communities Program to replace sections of I-375, the construction of which destroyed many Black-owned businesses and homes, with a slower speed boulevard with wider sidewalks and reconnections to neighborhood streets. Outside of major highway reconstruction projects, which admittedly can be costly and take a great deal of time, cities should continue to be mindful of who lives near pollution sources and make efforts to be equitable in future development. This could involve limiting the construction of schools, office buildings, and housing, particularly public housing, within certain bounds of highways. City agencies could also implement more detailed project review for new investments in and around highways, including requiring health impact assessments or air quality mandates in certain zones prior to construction. Cities can also consider construction and maintenance practices that promote better indoor air quality. Using this knowledge, cities can also work to implement more rigid air quality monitoring. The Louisville Metro, for example, is currently supported by the Louisville Air Pollution Control District, which monitors ambient air at 5 stations in the area and regulates pollution sources. And community organizations in Houston, for example, have supported similar work, as you will hear from one of our panelists today. Cities across the country may consider expanding these air quality monitoring networks past what the EPA requires to ensure that their residents get the best protection and can live long and healthy lives. So now we're going to transition to our panel. We're joined today by 4 experts with a range of experience in research and on-the-ground work around air pollution, its effects on local populations, and mitigation and monitoring efforts. So our speakers today are Richard Baldauf, a senior research engineer at the Environmental Protection Agency, whose research focuses on the development of policies and best practices to mitigate air pollution emissions and impacts at local, urban, and global scales. Jayajit Chakraborty, professor of geography and the founding director of the Socio-Environmental and Geospatial Analysis Laboratory at the University of Texas at El Paso, whose research focuses on environmental justice, climate justice, health disparities, and community vulnerability to hazards and disasters. Madeline Dapp, a senior researcher on the Urban Innovation Team at Microsoft Research. His research focuses on the collaborative use of innovative data sources and technologies to promote health equity and foster climate adaptation. And Harrison Humphreys, the climate programs manager at Airlines Houston, leading the organization's transportation initiatives that directly affect livability in Houston. Richard, Jayajit, Madeline, and Harrison, thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, happy to be here.
Hi, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Richard. So we'll get started with our panel. So we have a list of questions that we'll discuss for a little over around 40 minutes, and then we'll also have an opportunity to discuss some audience questions. The first question I wanted to put forward to our panel. So today I've discussed just a little bit about what we know so far, but what are some of the gaps in the existing research around this issue?
I can take a shot at that one if it's fine with the other panelists. Yeah, I think first of all, your report that you just mentioned as part of your presentation provides an excellent overview of the current state of academic research on this issue, and then your case study in Louisville, Kentucky that you briefly covered, I think illustrates some of the methods that are currently being used to document the characteristics of people and institutions who are located near highways. So that's, I think, a very good starting point and will be a useful resource. I just wanted to quickly mention 3 issues in terms of data gaps and future research needs for moving this work forward. And number one, I think that a lot of, most of the published studies on living near roads have focused on the negative impacts such as pollution exposure, which is, I think, very important. But there are also positive impacts or benefits such as, better access to economic opportunity, education, food, healthcare. So it would be interesting to see, or at least future studies should look at comparing the environmental costs with various benefits of living near roads for local residents. That's kind of missing from at least the academic literature. And it's also interesting in my own research in urban areas of Texas, which are mostly based on phone surveys of households and residents. A lot of the survey respondents mentioned living close to public transit or living near a bus stop to be more important to them than the negative environmental impacts, especially for those residing near roadways and highways. So that got me thinking we definitely need more comparative research on environmental costs versus socioeconomic benefits, as well as factors that influence the residential choices, whether or not how restricted they are, etc., for local residents. That wasn't the first thing. And the second thing, I think when it comes to information on the racial, ethnic, or economic status of people living near roads or further away, I guess, in terms of disparities, a lot of these studies are still based on data from the US Census or the American Community Survey, ACS 5-year estimates. And there are some problems with that. And one limitation that I or many of my, colleagues and students run into is the lack of data on income and poverty for smaller census units, such as tracts or block groups, especially in the less urbanized areas with smaller population. And even if income or poverty data are available for tracts or block groups, they often have very large margins of error, which make them somewhat unreliable, right? When you're looking at the environmental justice results, I think it becomes kind of difficult. And there's no clear path in terms of how to incorporate these large margins of errors. And again, while on the topic of American Community Survey data and how to use census units, and anytime we draw buffer zones around line features such as roadways, roadways, they're not really spatially, I should say, compatible with boundaries of census units, for which socio-demographic data are published here. In terms of shape and size is what I'm referring to. So when the shape or geometry doesn't match between the buffer zones and these irregular census units, we have to make assumptions about how people are distributed across census units and use methods that might lead to inaccurate counts of populations and various subgroups. Again, might affect the results. But in recent years, private vendors and researchers have developed like gridded population data sets and gridded indicators of social vulnerability, which I think can be a little more useful because they do combine ACS data with cadastral data on tax lots or land parcels, aerial photographs, land use maps. So I think that can provide more accurate estimates, especially when looking at distances like 150 meters or less than 300 meters like you did in your study. So future research, we need to look beyond census units and ACS data, and adding information on schools, workplaces, I think it's a step in the positive direction. And the last issue, if I still have a minute or two, I think a lot of studies, the current and past, have relied on these fixed distance buffers. 300 meters, I think, is the most common one for roadways. 150, I've seen published papers that have done that. Again, a good starting point, but I think for future, it's research important to look beyond proximity and look at the traffic volume and mix on roadways, as well as the quantity and quality of air or noise pollution generated. And there are a lot of interesting data sets that are coming out that I think that can be useful for the research. One of my students is using this National Transportation Noise Mapping tool that's produced by the US Department of Transportation's Bureau of Transportation Statistics. So that's like a 30 meter by 30 meter gridded data set that provides very accurate estimates of noise pollution, which can be applied, I think, these data sets can definitely complement and extend the distance-based buffer analysis, which is a very useful starting point. I'm going to stop here and wait for the other panelists to jump in. Thanks.
Well, this is Rich, and if it's okay if I jump in. First, too, I wanted to apologize that I'm not able to be on video today. But again, I'll try to interact and participate to the extent possible. A few things I wanted to mention as well. You did bring up in your presentation, Gabe, about electric vehicles and the future of that fleet. And, that is still though a gap. How will this increase in EVs and actually too looking at automated vehicles as well as that technology continues to evolve? How will those vehicles, how will the activities affect near road air pollution? Often people think of EVs as zero emission, but as you pointed out, that's not the case. There's still going to be brake wear, tire wear. A lot of the brake and tire wear is what causes re-enchained road dust. So that will continue as well. But there's been much less research on brake and tire wear emissions compared to tailpipe emissions. So there still needs to be more research on that, especially how these different types of vehicle technologies will affect brake and tire wear. A few other things are, really more information on the association between traffic activity and near road air pollution and what those adverse effects are to health. We do see that concentrations of many pollutants are decreasing. However, we don't know how low these concentrations need to be before we don't start seeing these adverse health effects, especially when we're talking about the mixture of air pollutants emitted by vehicles. And then maybe the last thing I'll mention is a bit too on the interaction between air pollution and noise. We do see health studies suggesting, again, pretty significant adverse health effects from both of them, but we don't know what their combined effects are. Do they have synergistic effects on adverse health and even other things like you mentioned, cognitive development, neurological conditions, things like that. So I think we still need to explore and progress in research on some of these issues as well.
Yeah, I certainly agree with what everybody else has said. I want to lift up just a couple of things. I think a big thing is just really a need for more work on sort of short-term, real-time, localized exposures. There's some really, I mean, one of my favorite papers is Janet Curry's work on sort of easy pass toll congestion and the changes in adverse pregnancy outcomes just because people could go through the toll booth faster versus sort of idling. And so more sorts of forms of monitoring that can capture sort of not just, is there a highway here, but is there congestion on that highway, right? Like if you have a year where there's construction somewhere else in the city, is that rerouting people in such a way that it's adverse, disproportionately affecting people in that area? So I think, again, we have this incredible monitoring system across US cities thanks to the Clean Air Act, but looking at some of those sort of real-time hyper-local questions that people have. And then also something that I really like that you did in your brief is, looking at housing, looking at schools. There's a ton of work finally around sort of the inequitable impacts of these problems. And I think really honing in on some of those inequities with respect to respiratory vulnerability, right? So looking at seniors, looking at children, looking at people who are, particularly in sensitive periods, so pregnant people. And I think also looking at vulnerabilities that are modifiable, so like housing quality, right? So not just is this house next to a highway, but can you close the window? And if you close the window, does that actually protect people inside, right? So Josh Apte at Berkeley has just fascinating study of the impacts of wildfires, and looking at indoor versus outdoor purple air sensors, and finds that houses that are very expensive on Zillow are able to prevent that indoor infiltration in a way that very affordable houses aren't. So I think really thinking about how some of those key urban planning factors, modifiable factors like housing quality and ventilation and other things could be adapted in some of these areas.
Yeah, and just to round it out, I don't think I have much to add in terms of the type of data that is missing or in those gaps. But speaking to how it's actually applied to the planning process, just talking about a real world example of there's a massive I-45 expansion project here in Houston that's $10 billion. It's a 26-mile long corridor, and they're seeking to remake essentially the entire thing, expanding it in most places. And so speaking of all this data that is missing, that isn't being applied, in the draft environmental impact statement for this project, our state DOT actually made the extraordinary claim that despite the fact that this expansion would lead to 100% increase in vehicles miles traveled along the corridor, they were projecting that air quality would actually improve as a result of the project. And with that specific issue is actually the source from the fact that they were only looking and only required to look at a regional scale. They did not look at local air quality impacts to neighborhoods immediately adjacent. And that's just a huge issue just in the basic planning processes for how we approach projects. That what are DOTs and other planning entities required to look at and incorporate into their planning decisions.
Great, yeah, thanks everyone. Those are definitely, highlighting tons of gaps, but certainly areas that I think the research can go. It's, definitely achievable, I think, to expand that knowledge there. Thank you. So next question, I want to talk a little bit about air quality monitoring. It was discussed a little bit in this presentation. So obviously, as we mentioned, could be a really great way to monitor what's going on in cities. But what are some constraints that cities face in monitoring air quality, whether that's cost or access? And Madeline Harrison, you all have experience with this in your work. So yeah, please share any constraints that maybe you've experienced.
Yeah, cost is definitely one of the biggest constraints. Just not only cost for the actual monitoring infrastructure, but for the staffing for monitoring the data that comes through those and maintenance for the infrastructure for the monitors. So those are probably some of the biggest issues. I think one issue specific to Texas, but likely elsewhere in the US is the interactions between local and state institutions, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which handles a lot of the regulatory air monitoring in Texas, is often seen as pretty lax in terms of monitoring and enforcement. So there's a lot of issues with interactions between localities and states, but also just a lack of resources, a lack of physical infrastructure to maintain the monitoring network, and lack of staff to maintain all of that as well.
Yeah, I can certainly speak to this. So I've spent the last 2 years now building a low-cost sensing network across the city of Chicago with 115 sensors that have been operating since July of 2021. And the thing about low-cost sensors is, while they are very promising for filling exactly those gaps of real-time, hyper-local, all of these things, they're also kind of inaccurate, right? If they were as accurate as high-cost sensors, we wouldn't have high-cost sensors. And so you're dealing with this challenge of sort of really trying to meet regulatory standards for accuracy that were set, many years ago, that require ongoing maintenance and monitoring. They require people to change out filters. They lead to devices that cost tens of thousands of dollars. And then you have to put them in a place that's safe and a place that's protected. So you get them on rooftops where there's limited access, and you have to get an agreement to get access to that rooftop. And so, I've talked with cities where they might be really concerned about sulfur dioxide downwind of a certain plant or other facility, but the only rooftop they can get is upwind. And so really that access to the right sites, really the cost of the equipment. But then if you have the low cost sensors, then the challenges are getting to those levels of accuracy where you can actually use the data. Making sure that you have, so like a big finding of our first paper on this was be part of existing infrastructure maintenance routines. We worked with JC2Co, this advertising agency that is the world's largest provider of outdoor street furniture, and they sent their guys to check on these sensors every 2 weeks. And I think that was a very big differentiator in our project in terms of having much less missing data. So, being part of existing infrastructure maintenance routines, making sure that you have people who care about data quality, all of these things. And then on top of all of that, there's also the community and city capacity to work with and act on the data. So at the end of the day, right, it's folks on the ground who are going to be using these data in their advocacy campaigns and their work. It's folks at the city who are going to try to figure out how to actually use this to figure out whether they should be sending field inspectors, how they should be looking at their permits. And so also really that capacity to innovate on the part of the city, the capacity to work with data on the part of community groups. Those are critical needs that I'd love to see more people investing in.
And I just want to add, I think, Madeline, Harrison, those are great points and really lay out well the big challenges that occur. The only other couple things I would add is, also just handling the data itself. These monitors, create gigabytes of data, sometimes within just a day. And it's very difficult, the storage, the analysis of that. So having that expertise and the facilities to handle that type of data can be very a challenge. And then the other thing is communicating the data as well. So I think this is expanding on what you just said, Madeline, too. It's something we struggle with often as an agency, is how do we get this information across to people? How do we make it accessible to them, transparent to them? But we've had some projects. So we've had like a Village Green project, if anyone's familiar with that. There were benches where we had sensors out there and people could see their air quality in real time. And we've tried other projects like that too, but it's always been a big challenge. So I think that's something else that some innovative techniques need to be developed for that as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with the excellent points made by all the panelists. I don't really have anything to add, except that, both the placement of monitors as well as, how the results get used can sometimes be controversial, especially in cities like El Paso, Texas, where I'm from, which are on the US-Mexico border. And a lot of the monitoring controversies and debates center around how much of it's coming from the industrial manufacturing facilities on the other side of the border, on the Mexican side, and et cetera. So it's just usage of the results sometimes can be really complicated in certain locations. But otherwise, I totally agree with the points that have been made. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all for those really thoughtful answers. I kind of want to follow up, especially on this point of resident awareness and access to this knowledge, as a lot of you touched on. Other than the obvious benefit of awareness and knowing what the air quality issues are in one's own neighborhood, how is this something that can lead to improved air quality or bring other benefits? This increased resident awareness and access to this knowledge.
Harrison, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, okay. I was waiting to see if anyone else was going to jump in, but yeah, it's incredibly valuable to have this information in the hands of residents. Going back to the example I brought up earlier with this massive I-45 expansion, it's very controversial here in Houston. But the primary reason our fight against it and our advocacy efforts to try to stop or improve the project has been successful up to this point is essentially because Houstonians had knowledge and information to push back on the DOT and its claims about what this project would do in terms of air quality, in terms of flooding, in terms of congestion mitigation. Without that, I don't know if we would be very successful in our advocacy efforts. I mean, just the understanding of adding more cars to the road and not necessarily solving the congestion issue is going to massively increase our air quality issues. So, I mean, just to sum it all up, broad understanding of the true impacts of the I-45 project is essentially the only reason it hasn't gone forward at this point. But just beyond, this specific example, residents understanding more about the built environment and its effects on their public health is it can improve a number of different processes and infrastructure decisions.
Yeah, I want to lift up resident awareness and engagement as something that goes both ways, in the sense that, residents often have a lot of real expertise from lived experience that can and should inform these projects, and vice versa, right? Experts, public health and urban planning and atmospheric science experts also have a lot of expertise, but it's kind of in that overlapping of those two sorts of knowledge that you start to get really interesting research questions and you start to get real advances. So for example, in Chicago, there's a ton of concern around congestion with respect to new warehouses coming in the city. And that wasn't necessarily at the top of anybody's radar in terms of a research agenda. You're not seeing EPA or NSF funding to look at warehousing congestion, but it is at the very top of environmental justice research agendas. It's at the top of, concerned mothers research agendas. And so certainly for us, as we thought about how to design our network and how to think about what the core priorities on the ground would be, we sort of developed this framework of, success would mean a network that was credible and actionable. So credible meaning people took the data seriously, it was real signal and not just noise. There's not a lot of missing data. And actionable meaning it's, can be part of people's existing advocacy agendas, can be part of work that the city, city policy making can inform some of that work. And as external folks, it's not like I work for Microsoft, right? This is a philanthropic and research project. It was done at no cost to the city. And so it was really important not to overstep with respect to policymaking, right? At the end of the day, that's the residents of Chicago have to decide what they want to do about their air. And so understanding that was a form of expertise, that was a form of skill that residents on the ground had. And through that work of collaborating, through that work of working together, we could help folks learn more about, PM 2.5 versus NO2 and titration versus ozone and what's going on in different neighborhoods. And then at the end of the day, it was sort of, they had to take that knowledge, remix it and figure out what to do about it. And so that's why I just think really having different forms of expertise in the loop, community expertise, as well as scientific expertise, as well as technological and policy expertise is just critical to what it means to do this work successfully.
Yeah, and I just want to build off of that. I think it's also important to consider that this data is very useful for local decision makers as well. So local government agencies, even planners, developers, like Madeline's example, warehousing being an important issue. Well, that's the kind of information that's needed by these agencies who are doing the funding. So this data can be really useful to highlight that as well.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Oh, that's right. Dr. Chakrabarty, you have something to add?
I don't have anything to add, but I was keep thinking, and because a lot of excellent points have been made already. I was also thinking in terms of at least within going back to the academic literature, which I'm probably more familiar with than the practical examples. But I think there is also this issue of how we can, in terms of citizen science in general, how citizen science, how can it lead to effective decision making? And I was thinking in terms of one of the EPA's definition of environmental justice is about meaningful involvement and equal access to participation in the decision making process, right? So better knowledge, better data is one part of that, but there have to be opportunities and for making sure that communities who are potentially or really affected, as well as disadvantaged communities, also get to are aware of opportunities for participation in decision meeting and meetings and other, I think, forums where they can voice their concerns and make sure that the data reaches, I think, the people who are involved in making decisions locally and regionally.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Again, really thoughtful answers. I want to move forward now to kind of thinking about, towards the future and these mitigation strategies that some cities may take. So as we touched on in the presentation and already in some of your answers, cities across the country are turning towards these multimodal solutions, to reduce pollution at the source, right? So tearing down highways and replacing them with boulevards, building underground roadways, implementing congestion pricing, Madeline, as you mentioned, among, a number of other strategies. So what are some of the potential impacts that these strategies can have from your knowledge?
I can go first again. Yeah, I mean, so I think you've described one of the sort of main two prongs of reducing mobile emissions is switching mode switch from passenger vehicles to other modes, and then there's electrification. We're very excited about the potential benefits from efforts like highway removal, or just generally prioritizing multimodal infrastructure over continuing to prioritize car infrastructure. So particularly for places like Houston, where a disproportionate amount of our greenhouse gas emissions come from passenger vehicles and from our transportation system overall, the shift to multimodal infrastructure is incredibly important and is really key for us to come even close to reducing enough emissions to stave off cataclysmic climate change. So, in terms of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, we're very excited about things like highway removal, improving public transit, improving walkability. But there's a number of other co-benefits. Prioritizing multimodal infrastructure over car infrastructure can improve access, can improve connectivity, and really benefits more people than just invested in highways.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Harrison. I guess that what I kind of tend to think about in these types of questions is just how site specific, though, a lot of these solutions are, and we really want to also, though, avoid unintended consequences as well. And I think to achieve those benefits that you laid out, Harrison, it's just really important to look at it from a demand standpoint. We have to change the car demand and the truck demand for other types of modes and much cleaner technologies as well. Because again, if like a highway removal project, you have the ability to improve air quality at that local street level. But again, some of the potential, negative or unintended consequences are, that traffic and emissions may increase in other locations if you haven't removed that, demand for cars, or even things like fewer lanes. Again, if you haven't, removed that demand for cars, you can increase congestion, increase idling, and actually, increase air pollution as well. And so that's why, along with those, we often tend to try to look at, other mitigation strategies as well that can be done kind of in a toolkit type of approach, but again, often need to really be evaluated at the project location scale, which does require then a pretty transdisciplinary team and a lot of expertise.
Yeah, I agree with the point Richard just made. I think there are studies that show that the idea of displacing or moving the problem somewhere else, and at least a lot of scholars have kind of connected this to the not in my backyard, revisiting the not in my backyard syndrome, because it moves to somebody else's backyards. It's just no, emissions do reduce in one part of the city or urban area, but they might go up. But as long as traffic volumes and demand haven't changed, I think it's just not going to be a long. It might work in the short term, but not in the long term. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I love Harrison's sort of point about really this like whole suite of policies around multimodal solutions, as well as thinking about highways, as well as street redesigns. And of course, Richard is right that these things are site specific, and so you have to think about the specific context. I do want to lift up, I think, I think the greatest policy in the last 4 decades is the Clean Air Act, right? This is a truly, truly extraordinary policy, and it's extraordinary, I think, for 2 reasons. One is that it's grounded in the science, and the other is that it updates, right? They convene their scientific advisory board and they update the Clean Air Act every few years to make sure that it's grounded in the most recent scientific evidence. And I would love to see, a 21st century update to that similarly looks at equity, prioritizes equity, prioritizes looking at decarbonization, looking at CO2, as well as these health benefits, the public health relevant forms of air pollution. And really thinking about sort of having, maybe having a community as well as a scientific advisory board, and sort of making sure that not only are folks thinking about this sort of broad suite of policies to address these problems, but that they're also actively monitoring the impacts of each of these policies, both overall and in terms of equity, and improving them as they go. So, if you look at congestion pricing, there's all of this evidence in Stockholm and London that it leads to these big benefits, but you also see effects right at the edge of the congestion pricing zone in London. And so London had to go and change that policy to deal with the edge effects. And there are concerns now in New York City around equity issues if people reroute through the Bronx because there's congestion pricing in Manhattan. Again, that's something where you could think about, okay, what does it look like to continue to improve this policy and continue to modify these things as these problems come to light? And so I just think that there's really an opportunity right now with advances in the forms of monitoring that are possible, with advances in sort of the coalitions that are being built around this area, and sort of the critical importance of making clear that the public health co-benefits of decarbonization are probably the biggest benefits that people will immediately see in their local environments, and using that to really take seriously some of these calls for change.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. I think, at least my takeaway from all this is, right, this is something that has to be addressed at all levels. You can't really just fix this with one, maybe federal policy or one local action. This is really, there's tons of ways that this needs to be looked at. All right, so I want to give us one last question before we shift into our audience Q&A. So taking into account the variety of climates, landscapes, and population densities across the country, how may roadway pollution mitigation strategies differ throughout the United States? And where do you anticipate any challenges maybe in these differences in terms of bringing pollution down by highways?
I guess I can start it off that, again, just kind of that reiteration of, that's very site specific. So, one mitigation method that might be effective in one, city or neighborhood might not be as effective in another. And then even surrounding land use can, make a big difference on, what kinds of mitigation strategies could be implemented. I think there's a lot of questions too around, getting the more information so that people really do have a good identification of the costs and how to prioritize, what these impacts are versus other areas, and then I think there's also other kinds of, mitigation strategies that we had talked that haven't been really talked about as much. There's been a lot of efforts around doing putting highways underground, doing deck parks. And while again, those can have, benefits along those highways that are being moved underground, there could still, again, be like edge effects and other kind of impacts as well. There's been research that actually our group has done a lot on roadside infrastructure. So things like solid walls, roadside vegetation. Again, some designs and characteristics can have great local scale air quality benefits, can really reduce exposures and concentrations near roads, but other designs and characteristics can have either no effect and sometimes could actually increase air pollution near these sources. So again, kind of coming back to that issue of being very site specific and really leading these transdisciplinary groups to tackle the problems in the different neighborhoods and locations.
Yeah, kind of continuing on that answer of it being site specific, looking at Texas in general, highways are king in Texas, and their proliferation has essentially been encoded into law. One of the biggest issues we're facing here in Texas is that 97% of our state-produced transportation funds, that doesn't include any federal funds, but 97% of our state-produced, state-sourced transportation funds are constitutionally dedicated to being used on highways. Our DOT can't use that on multimodal infrastructure, even if they wanted to, and that is a whole nother question. But that, that's just one extreme example of how highways as the primary solution to transportation issues has been embedded into our planning practices, our laws, our everything from municipal code all the way up to federal code. So that's how we fund our projects and how we prioritize it is a big challenge in reducing highway pollution.
Yeah, I was also thinking in a slightly different context, site-specific challenges. I mean, I keep thinking about truck traffic on the US-Mexico border, or I guess on highways that connect the US with Mexico. Because, in the El Paso, Texas area, there are several bridges that connect the two cities of El Paso, Texas, and Juarez, Mexico. And you have these trucks that serve industries or maquiladoras on the Mexican side that use one of the larger bridges, which is kind of a toll-free bridge. And they spend many long hours daily waiting on the road that connects to this international bridge, which actually, a road that actually intersects a low-income neighborhood, as well as a couple of schools. So these idling trucks that are waiting to cross the international bridge generate very high volumes of, air pollution daily, diesel contamination, which has really affected the health of children who live and go to school in these neighborhoods, as well as elderly and other vulnerable residents. And I think for the last couple of years, there have been several protests and requests, but it has even come close to mitigation. I mean, not a single health assessment study has been conducted on, again, border truck traffic by local agencies or the state government. So there's this reluctance to engage into something that can be controversial, because it involves, I guess, two different countries and international flow of traffic. So in certain locations, it can be particularly challenging, going back to your question. Thanks.
I think folks have mostly said everything that I would want to say. I just maybe just to lift up kind of like health in all policies, equity in all policies frameworks, that these might be ways to start to at least just sort of make visible some of the costs.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, again. So it's 3:50 Eastern time here. So we're going to transition for our last 10 minutes into some audience questions that I'll bring up with you all. Some of them I'll try to answer, the rest I'll leave to you all. I just want to note, I've seen there's a ton of really incredible questions that have been asked. I'm not sure we'll be able to get to all of those. Hopefully we'll get to a good amount. But any lingering questions, I mean, I'd say, please feel free to email me. But we'll start with the first question I see here from Kate Covey. So can you more explicitly talk about the tension between the negative repercussions of transit, like pollution, versus the more positive things like connectivity? And any kind of thoughts from that? If anybody, I'll leave up to our panelists, anybody would like to respond to that one?
Yeah, I think I briefly referred to that in answer to your first question, right, Gabe? And I think I was trying to talk about the lack of systematic studies or empirical research on the topic, because there are studies that focused on the positive impacts in terms of improve access. And there are studies, like your report that we're discussing today, that focus on the negative impacts, which are mostly pollution related. So I think I think the point I was making earlier is that there needs to be research that looks at the trade-offs at an individual or household level. And most of the time we are using aggregated secondary data, which may not be useful for doing that. And I mentioned surveys, right? Individual level households or surveys of people and households who live near highways that can talk about these trade-offs that they had to make in their personal lives and decisions that affect, or where they live and how they benefited from that location or how they're suffering by staying in that location. So there needs to be more work that kind of, like I said, a comparative framework to look at the environmental costs versus economic, social, and cultural benefits in terms of improve access to education, food, healthcare, and jobs. Of course, I mean, that's something that has been investigated. But to me, that needs to go beyond aggregated secondary data, look at individual household level data, which can be more challenging, more expensive, and more time consuming for that kind of study. But that's, I think, the only way to answer those questions that have not been examined adequately. Thanks.
Just one thing that I do want to lift up from the work that Gabe and Yona did is just the sort of your evidence of this high fraction of people who did not own cars living in that 300-meter space right by the highways. That seems very important to understand that the folks who are benefiting most from the connectivity and the highway may not be the folks who are being most harmed. And so recognizing that, of course, this is critical infrastructure that gets people to their jobs and to their homes and everywhere they need to go every day. But that not everybody is using that infrastructure, and that there are some serious inequities in who's benefiting and who's most exposed.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. If I could quickly follow up to that, I think it'd be useful to look at roadways or highways that provide public transportation, and those that do and those that do not, and that could get into vehicle ownership issues, and you might see a clear difference, right, in terms of expanded in this work to look at accessibility issues. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, this ties into, more of a need for this public transit oriented development and making sure that people have, again, as you all mentioned, multimodal ways of getting, to work and to where they need to go. I'll take on this next question from Sarah Bagley, who asked, how are you able to tease out the impacts of the highways on health, cognition, et cetera, from other factors, such as lower incomes, food deserts, food insecurity? So I believe this is towards me for our report. It's a great question. I want to note, so our research on health impacts from highways, that was all secondary. That was based on literature review from a number of other scholars. I want to note they've all done really good jobs of teasing this out, making sure that it's a direct factor and avoiding those kind of those other factors as confounding variables. So definitely encourage you to look through those. I know there's a big list of references in our paper, especially right below our health impacts kind of table early on. I do also, this is an important point though, right? There are other factors on pollution. For example, other point source factors, including factories or airports. There's, a massive airport in the middle of Louisville. So these are other things that need to be considered too. It's not, exclusively highways. Wondering if you all have any other thoughts on that, but otherwise I can move forward.
Can I just put in a quick plug for, and I'm not sure if it made it into your report time-wise, the Health Effects Institute just redid their large meta-analysis of, near road and traffic-related health impacts. And it was hundreds of studies that were reviewed. And so they lay out actually how they control for all those different factors in there and how each study does and how they did that in their meta-analysis. So I'd really recommend people take a look at that reference as well to get those descriptions.
Yeah, thanks for that plug. I don't believe we had that in there. So that's really helpful to hear about. Great. I'll move on then to another question from Nicole George. So has there been any research on the impact of living close to transportation, property, abutting highways that results in undermanaged property infrastructure and dead space, or any research on the collective impact between the combined health and social stressors created by noise, air quality, litter, overgrowth, graffiti, inappropriate land use such as homeless encampments, etc. I'm going to put this forward to you all if you have a response to this. If you've worked with this research, I don't believe this is something we really looked at in terms of our paper. Again, maybe a limitation, or focusing exclusively on these roadways. But any of our panelists, do you have thoughts on this question?
Yeah, just to briefly touch on that second question, and really kind of what you're describing is like cumulative impacts, and our understanding of cumulative impacts and the totality of all the different things that go into how infrastructure affects our health is growing. And I think everyone else on this panel, being more academic than I, would probably have a much better understanding of the details of those cumulative impacts. But I'll just say, in terms of policy, we really haven't caught up to implementing that the planning entities that handle major infrastructure projects haven't really done a great job of incorporating considerations of cumulative impacts into project planning and those sort of processes.
Yeah, I do. I don't actually know the literature here, and I would love to know more actually about certainly the social stress impact and any sort of price impacts as well. I think that would be fascinating and a really important complementary literature. I do want to lift up, in terms of sort of folks who are unhoused living in these areas, that's something certainly that I've become increasingly aware of, is that when folks are pushed from when folks are living in encampments, of course they're uniquely vulnerable to air pollution because they're intense, right? You don't have the protection of a building, and you've maybe got respiratory vulnerabilities, you've maybe got other vulnerabilities, and certainly here in Seattle, folks are increasingly pushed to south of downtown, areas that are industrially zoned where they won't be visible to folks. They won't be folks who are uncomfortable being around an encampment aren't seeing them. And so that means that they tend to be in areas like highways and like industrially zoned areas where there are the worst air pollution effects. Now, those are probably mostly chronic effects, so it's probably not the highest priority thing that folks in those situations are dealing with. But I want to lift that up for all of us as really like a very vulnerable population, a population that's exposed to serious, a population that might have higher asthma attack risk or higher cardiovascular risk. That's really being exposed to some of these worst air pollution effects, and one that we should take seriously and also consider, prioritizing for some research and ideally health interventions.
Yeah, thank you. Again, really great responses. I want to sneak in one last question that we had from our audience. I'm going to try to pull it up because I think it's a great question to kind of wrap up on. Sorry. All right, so this one comes from Sharon Yost. Again, apologies to all those who asked questions that we didn't ask. So from Sharon, can you share emerging or best practices for preventing displacement and relocation of residents, especially low-income residents, and small businesses from infrastructure expansion to prevent replication of harmful policies and practices in the past, and or to ensure that there's shared prosperity as neighborhoods and community infrastructure investment enhance neighborhoods? So again, I know we're almost out of time, but one or two responses to this, if you got some, would be great.
I think my answer to that would be I don't know if we have set standard best practices for how to do that, and it's just because it's such a prevalent issue that happens every day with major infrastructure projects. And I don't know if we've come up with a way to prevent that from happening, and it needs to happen. We displacement is a huge issue, and I'm sounding like a broken record talking about our I-45 expansion issue, but that project is slated to displace over 1,000 people and hundreds of businesses. And the DOT didn't even really see an issue with that. It's just sort of a necessary evil to achieve the goal of congestion reduction, or whatever it is an infrastructure project is trying to achieve. And the only way we've been able to even prevent that from happening up to this point is through legal action. So that's to say it is a huge issue, and it's something that needs to be addressed in a holistic, comprehensive manner. And I don't know if we have best practices up to this point.
And no, we don't, but it's interesting that we started, I think the first question was about gaps and future needs, and this is definitely one of them. We do need best practices to be documented, right, preventing this from happening. So it's a great question that really points an urgent need for future.
Great. Any last thoughts from any of our panelists?
I think I just want to amplify what Harrison and Jayajit said, that looking at sort of affordable housing that is not in these most environmentally impacted locations, but still in desirable connected locations, making sure that sort of these policies also fund multimodal solutions, because as many of our question askers noted, electrification isn't necessarily a silver bullet, although it does lead to meaningful improvements. And I just want to thank everybody for these really thoughtful and good questions that certainly will I'll be thinking about them in my research agenda going forward, and I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you all for having us.
Thank you very much.
I agree. I think it was very interesting, and this really highlights the need for more work in this area and more progress. Thank you.
All right. So with that, I want to again second our panelists. Thanks to everyone who asked these really incredible questions. Again, apologies we didn't get to all those. I also want to throw those thanks back to our panelists for their just really incredible answers, really, touching on their experience, their expertise. It's been great having you all here and hearing your, diverse viewpoints. I feel positive about kind of where we're going in this direction, knowing that we have people like you, working on these issues. And I'm, your knowledge definitely inspired, our presentation, our work. So I appreciate that. And I'm sure we'll continue to inspire others. So with that, I know we're a little over time, but that does end our webinar. A reminder to those who are still here to fill out that survey if you get the chance. And if you want to learn more, you can check out, again, that paper at urban.org. You can look up any of our researchers or any of our panelists and see the work that they've been doing. And yeah, thank you all for coming. This has been great.
Thanks, y'all.